your symbol on our sword and then kill you with it. But I think that's a big mystery for me is why they would incorporate that cross, which wasn't a symbol that...
No, it was not.
Yeah.
It was not.
Well, you know, the cross could have different meanings, so it doesn't necessarily... It could have just been a plus sign.
You're right. Yeah.
It could have been, but I don't know that it was. But and we're going to dive into that shortly as to the use of that and what that could actually mean.
Okay.
But just to finish up on this, the one guy made it. That's Bupkis.
Yeah.
The swords were made for about 200 years.
Could have been a family
So one
operation.
dude would have been really busy, and then his family sold them forever.
Well, like Thor was how old when he, right? Valhalla. If the guy didn't, what? No? Nobody's like following my demigod theory here?
No, I'm not going to run with the demigod theory.
Okay.
I like it, but I'm not going to run with it.
Fine.
It is also theorized that maybe it was a family or a shop that continued to make the swords.
Sure.
But again, we don't know who they are. I like that idea. I like
that. Seems quite possible.
Yeah.
And then the reason it could have been kind of a trade secret. You know, they didn't share the technology with anybody because
and
obviously that was a livelihood. And then something happened, you know, like the factory burned down or just the last of them died off, and they took the secret with them.
And I can run with that theory. But that again,
not the demigod theory, though.
Not the demigod theory, though. But the problem is that doesn't say who made them. As in, where were these people at?
Or where did they get the technology from?
And that will then lead us down to our next theory. It's been theorized that people in the area where the steel was made were actually also then making the swords. So this means that they would have come out of that Iran or Kazakhstan area, or maybe even India, and they were making those swords and then selling them to the Vikings. And some researchers will say, and we say this is true because along the river Volga, they have found Ulfbert swords in the water. Okay, personally, to me, that doesn't work because if this sword is so highly prized and sought after, and I'm a successful Viking trader, I'm probably going to have been able to buy one for myself, and I'm going to continue to do my trading routes. And it's possible then, over the course of 200 years, somebody's going to lose a couple swords on that route, rather than saying there was a ship full of these swords and then it sank.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the other thing for me is that the shape of the swords in the Middle East were so different, and they were also well suited to the kind of combat that they were doing. But that for them to say, oh, we're going to make these swords, and we're going to totally deviate and innovate in this totally new way. We're not going to do the curved sword. We're going to do something completely different that nobody's ever seen before, specifically for the Vikings. That seems like a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it is a stretch.
You know, but it's quite possible that people can come up with a new innovation and something different from the traditional, something that works a little bit better.
Absolutely, but then why wouldn't they be utilizing it in their own swords?
Yeah,
right? You would see that more in the Middle Eastern swords.
The Middle Eastern swords tended to be curved, and they didn't have a fuller, which the fuller is, if you look down the length of a blade, there is a bevel in the center of them. And all of the Ulfbert swords had that fuller in them. That was something that was never used in that area.
Yeah. And so I know.
I can't put myself behind that one because
if they'd been made, say in India or Afghanistan, you would find copies of them there, at least a few.
And that's the other issue. You don't find them there.
Yeah.
So I can't lend myself to that one.
Yeah.
But let's move on, Devin. This is what you brought up earlier, which is referring to the cross and maybe its significance.
Yeah.
And historians point out that the word Ulfbert is a Frankish word.
Yeah.
And they presume that the swords must have been made in that region because of the inlay. And for everybody, that's modern-day Germany. That's in that region that it would have been done. And it does stand to reason that they could have been made there. A lot of weapons and armor. And they were a major arms manufacturing place. They just kitted everybody out. And they profited quite handsomely.
Yeah,
actually, that tradition was carried on for many centuries, actually.
And there's also the fact that the cross in front of the name is a Greek equal-armed cross. So it's not what you see the Christian cross, which is a short cross arm and then a long vertical.
Right.
It's equal lengths
Right.
on all sides. And that was something that was used by the Roman Catholics. Specifically, it was used by abbots and bishops or sometimes monasteries in their signature.
Sure.
So they would sign that equal-armed cross and then their name. So it's plausible that means that it was made by an arms manufacturer that was
Maybe-
run by the church.
So it was Ulf and then T, right? Because the way that it goes is that it goes cross and then Ulf and then a cross and then a T, right? So, Ulfber.
Yeah,
goes
it
by
ends at the
Ulfber
H, and then there's a cross, and then there's a T.
So there was two guys. I'm sorry.
One guy
I'm
got
just
called
running
T.
with it. I
Yeah,
don't
you
know.
ran with it. That's
Sorry.
okay. So let's just presume that it's Frankish.
Yeah.
All right. And if we know that the cross is something that's used by the clergy, and like I said, the church was manufacturing at monasteries and places like that lots of arms because that's how they could support themselves. There's a couple of problems with that to me.
Okay.
The first one is, again, everybody considered the Vikings to be pirates and barbarians. And why would you sell arms to somebody who's likely to turn around shortly and raid you?
Well, I guess if I could use a modern interpretation, why do we sell arms to Afghanistan?
Actually, we don't sell arms to Afghanistan.
But for 200
we give
years?
them arms.
Yeah, why do we give them arms? I mean,
But
you
for
know.
Yeah.
200 years, I mean, I could see like one or two instances, but why would it happen for 200 years
Yeah,
is the
we've been
thing.
doing it for 50, I think.
Yeah, we've been doing it for a while. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good example,
Right.
but
Yeah,
I am
yeah.
saying that there is historical precedent
Oh, yeah.
of
There's-
people saying, oh, or like maybe they thought they were going to someone else. Maybe
Yeah.
they thought they were going to the Roman Empire, the like Roman legions that were there. And
But why
like,
wouldn't they
maybe
use that quality of steel in any of their other arms?
But
That's
is
the other
that?
issue.
Yeah,
And you would have been
yeah.
fine. You would have found other swords like it. being sold to
that
other people
quality.
around. Yeah.
Okay.
And here's the other problem. There were laws in place that were enacted by the Carolinian dynasty that forbid the sale of weapons to foreigners.
Okay.
Okay, so it's plausible to me, and I say this lightly, but it's plausible that the Vikings had purchased the ingots and then had shipped them to someone in that region. But if the sale of those arms to them is illegal, that's a huge risk to take for 200 years.
Yeah.
And again, why wouldn't you use that steel in some other stuff?
Yeah, it would.
Okay. All right, that's fair.
Okay. Here's the other thing that I want to point out about the possibility of it being made in the Frankish region is let's look at the number of swords that have been found. Okay, so there's a total of 171. And I don't have the exact numbers of what was found where, but there is a very small percentage of them that have been found in what was the Frankish realm and Christian England. Very small number of them, and all of those were found in rivers and lakes. The vast majority of the swords, however, have been found in the Scandinavian region in bodies of water or in Viking graves. So again, to me, that says if they were made in the Frankish realm, would you have found more of them there?
Okay, wait.
should
So
have,
I'm
yes.
formulating a question in
Yes.
my head. We're sure these swords were used.
Absolutely used.
They were
There were hymns and ballads or songs about them, and they were written about, and they were known.
They weren't gifts to a warrior going off to Valhalla, for instance.
Like
they weren't, like,
could
burial.
be buried with his sword.
They often were.
And swords would be used for, generations. And it also was not an uncommon practice in that culture to dig up your ancestor, to take his sword,
Okay.
to then continue on the glory of that sword.
Sure. And they also weren't big on giving awards right? Like this wasn't like the Purple Heart of the Viking culture.
Correct.
Okay.
You had to buy
Okay.
this sword.
All right.
It wasn't a freebie.
All right, I'm on board.
Probably wasn't cheap given the technology at the time.
No, it wasn't. But yeah, so it just seems weird to me that so few have been found in those areas, and yet people say because that was the arms area and the cross, it must mean that that's where it was made.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, this, I really like this theory, and I completely came up with this theory on my own.
Which is why you like it.
Which is why I like it, which is, what if it was some awesome Viking?
Yeah.
In other words, I think we talked about this before, is that what if there's some Viking who goes to these, where the crucible steel is being made and sees how they're making it, and then says, you know, I could just buy these ingots and then make my own sword because I know how awesome the steel is.
Or-
and then he comes
yeah.
home and it's one guy or one family of Vikings that is making them all locally.
That's kind of a theory that I like. Now, so in other words, to shape this into a blade, though, you'd have to get the ingot and bring it back and melt it back down and
You
back
don't, you
into the shape of
don't, you don't truly
shape of a
melt
blade.
it. You stick it in the fire so it's malleable, and then you
And then
begin
you
to
pound it,
hammer
you
and work
hammer it out, yeah.
into a shape. That's
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah, so that's that's a plausible theory because the whole idea is like this is really common throughout history, even in our own time, is you get smart people who come up with a good idea and they make it work for a while, and then of course it dies out for one reason or another. So
Yeah, I really, really like this just because, again, as I said before, people seem to discredit the Vikings because of their practices, but they were very ingenious.
Yeah.
And so I kind of think it's plausible some guy or some family's like, we make swords all the time, but I know that this stuff is awesome steel, and I know that I can make some fantastic swords, and while I'm at it, let me go ahead and brand them. I mean, to me, it seems plausible that a guy could figure that out and make them.
Isn't this the same theory as it was just one guy that we disproved like a couple
No,
minutes ago?
I'm not saying one guy, but one guy goes and realizes the potential of the material that he's seeing, because he's seeing crucible steel in their swords, and he's thinking, well, let me bring these back, and then somehow, he sets a shop.
Oh.
So that's where I'm thinking. He sees the technology used somewhere else, and then says, well, if I can import that stuff, we can make these.
Sure.
and I would
Ulfberg Inc. launches.
I would venture to say too that it was probably more than one guy.
Oh, it
Probably.
had to be.
Probably a lot of guys, because if they found 171 swords, that means that probably far, far more than that were actually made. And so there were probably, for a couple hundred years, all kinds of people churning these things out.
Yeah. So it had to be a shop, basically.
Or shop, or it could have been it could have been a number of shops.
Or a village.
Or a village
Or
or
it
something
takes
like
a
that.
village.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's another theory, which, again, this one to me, kind of plausible, but I couldn't find any research on it. And I just want to say this, that the lack of research and evidence doesn't disprove something. In other words, just because nothing says it isn't that doesn't mean it isn't. It's possible, we just don't know yet.
Right, yeah.
So the other thing about the Vikings is that they weren't above taking slaves.
Oh, yeah.
So they may very well have bought a slave in the Near East and then brought him home, and he said, hey, well, I'm a smith, and by the way, where I came from, they make this awesome material, and if you get it for me, I can then go ahead and make swords for you, and then the shop goes from there.
Or it was one of those people from the Abbey who had to flee or was captured or whatever, right? And same kind of idea, was enslaved and was like, oh, hey, instead of killing me, how about I tell you about this awesome process that I have and teach it to a bunch of people. And yeah, I like that theory.
Yeah, it makes sense. It kind of humanizes it.
Yeah,
You think,
absolutely.
well, what would people do? Well, I want to live,
Well, that was
and
the
I got to
thing they
prove
did.
something that's valuable to you.
Absolutely. They did it, in the Roman Empire, you hear about it happening all the time with slaves. There were slaves that were worth a lot of money because they could read or write or
yep.
teach or something. and they were kept alive, and they had a much better life. They were essentially citizens.
And they were allowed to have families.
As opposed to being like kind of mistreated slave. I think that was the thing that happened a lot in the olden days. Is, if you were enslaved for one reason or another, you could say, "Hey, I'm good at this thing."
So what you're saying is kids should pay attention in school, so they'll be more valuable as slaves later.
Yes.
Yeah, when
that's
the apocalypse
exactly what we're
happens,
saying.
Yeah,
totally.
hey kids, pay attention in school.
Stay in school.
Yes. Those are the theories as to who could have made the swords.
Well, now, quick question: the material itself, is that particular grade of steel found in swords from, say, Afghanistan or Iran?
Yeah,
Is that same one?
it's equivalent. Yes.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, the research shows that iron ore came from that region, so it supports that must be where it was made, or where it was mined. Whether they brought the ore back and then melted it in a crucible themselves, or it would be simpler just to buy the ingot.
Yeah.
Save yourself a bunch of labor.
Trucking the ore back, that'd be a lot of work.
Yeah.
I don't see anybody saying, "Oh, this is great. I'm just going to fill a bunch of rocks," and I don't
fill my ship with rocks until it sinks.
Right. Yeah.
But that's the theories there for who could have made the swords themselves. We don't know. I mean, there's no direct link to anybody specifically. And again, the inscriptions don't seem to point to anybody either, so it makes it kind of tough. But it does then lead us on to the other question that I had, which is, and everybody's asked, which is, why did they stop making them?
Yeah.
Why suddenly in Europe are we not seeing these swords being made after the 10th century? What's going on here? Well, there's a couple of things that probably impacted it. One is historical evidence shows that the residents of modern-day Russia that were on the Volga essentially shut down all trade through there. They kind of locked down on the river. So you can't get through that area. It makes it hard to get your material. The other thing that could have brought the Ulfberht's production to a halt is the essential fall of the Viking Empire. If you look at the history, the late 10th centuries, the Vikings were taking a beating.
Yeah.
They were going on a lot of campaigns, and they were for hire, so they'd hire out to anybody's campaign. So now a lot of your guys are hiring out, and oh, whoops, he got killed, so you're losing more and more. Plus, at that time, Christianity was being adopted.
Yeah.
So now the Viking culture and a lot of their practices are being considered pagan. So people are being chased down and persecuted. So it could be that the people that knew how to make the swords died in a battle. They were executed or exterminated by the church, potentially. There's a whole slew of things that could have happened to them because that culture in that area was going through some pretty rapid changes, and more of the rulers were adopting these different religions and bringing in, and suddenly their culture is just getting watered down and falling.
Because they're not so warlike anymore. Right?
Well, it's they're changing in the way they weren't less warlike, I would say, but it was that suddenly all their practices are being stopped. In other words, in Christianity, you don't bury somebody with trinkets and gifts and things for them to go to Valhalla, to the afterlife with. Whereas in Viking culture, you gave them these things in their grave to take with them. So that's a traditional break. So there's a lot of breaks in tradition, and it may have been that the group that made them, all of their children broke away from them and said, "We don't believe in you, you're pagans, we're Christian now," and left the practice behind, and it was lost that way. I don't know. I mean, that's another question, is why'd they suddenly disappear?
Yeah.
I like the supply line drawing up the theory. Because the thing about it is, and it might not have been just the Russians blocking it, but it might have been the actual source of the ingots. They might have died off too. Wiped out by an earthquake. I mean, who knows? I mean, I don't know how many mines were producing the ore, how many foundries were producing the ingots.
Right.
It might have just been one. And what do we know, like Afghanistan and Iran for? Mega earthquakes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they could have, because I think if they had continued to produce this stuff, then you would have seen more swords made from this kind of steel crop up elsewhere in Europe. They wouldn't have necessarily been in the Viking
style. They didn't crop up anywhere during that 200 years.
Yeah, that's the intriguing thing. It seems like the